Number 20 in our top 100 countdown is Ken Rosewall, who won 8 major titles and 4 Davis Cup championships.
Ken Rosewall is a player's player. The players want to watch Ken Rosewall play. He's the one we're interested in watching.
Ken Rosewall was called Muscles because he didn't have any. He was just a little guy trying to get along, and boy, did he get along.
Ken was a different kettle of fish. He enjoyed it so much, he'd almost feel like he'd go to bed hitting a backhand.
The thing about his game was, it always looked as if he was hitting the right shot. He was so perfectly balanced. His court coverage was wonderful, his footwork immaculate, and he always looked in balance when he was making his shots.
The legend goes that Rosewall never got a bad bounce on any surface because he moved so well. He was low centre of gravity. He's only a short man by today's standards. But he hit the ball out of the centre of the racket every time because he had great footwork, a classic backhand with some of the greatest volleys that the world's ever seen.
One of the best backhands that's ever existed, a good thinker on the court, and probably one of the best first volleys that you're ever going to see.
He had the best backhand in the business because it was accurate, so accurate, and his return of serve was immaculate.
And because he wasn't, really tall, didn't have a huge serve, he had to be much smarter the way he played.
A very aggressive slice. He could actually hit passing shots with that slice in an era when there was a lot of net rushing and when you wouldn't have thought that was possible. And he could drive the ball past the likes of Laver and Newcomb. He had one of the truly majestic backhand volleys I've ever seen to go along with his backhand ground strokes.
He had the ability to play from the back of the court and then sneak in and finish points at net at will. And anybody that played against him will tell you that his ability to hit lines and hit it close to the lines and move people around was very annoying.
You could make an argument that Rosewall was the greatest player of all time because he was still winning titles in his 40s.
There is no player ever who has had the longevity that he had.
His first Wimbledon final, for example, was 1954, and his last was 74. And he won the U.S. championships 14 years apart, 1956 and 1970. To be in the finals of the 2 biggest tournaments as he was in 74, losing both to Connors when he's 39 years old, speaks for itself.
How old was he? 39 years old? The guy is amazing. I love him. He's one of my all-time favorites. When
he turned professional, he really grew the game, the opportunity for everybody to make money. Then he came back into the sport in the pro ranks and then still dominated. So to have that longevity is quite amazing.
He missed out on a lot of his great years because he was playing as a pro, and so he wasn't able to play in the Grand Slams because they were still amateur.
He's the little guy that nobody thinks is going to be any good. And that's why I hate people that give up on the little ones sometimes. They're the exceptions, but they're out there. And the racket is an equalizer.
Little Kenny Rosewall, he is at just about the top of my list.
Still the oldest U.S. Open champ at 35. Paul, he tested Father Time before it was the cool thing to do. How did he maintain that high level for so long?
Well, one of my favorite things about Ken Rosewall, looking back at some of these clips, talking to the old Australians, and hearing about how successful he was, is he was one of the best players at knowing his own game. You heard Billie Jean and some of the other legends in these clips talk about how good his backhand was, how good his footwork was. And remember, this is in a time with wood rackets, and you're not getting a lot of help with the backhand and the ground strokes. He had an incredible amount of stick on the backhand through the ball, got the court to help him with that movement, and a great mover. So he understood with his size, a little bit shorter, he had to be a great mover, had to use his backhand, had to use his tennis IQ to figure out to get up to the net. And you heard Rod Laver say he was a great volleyer. This guy was so solid up at the net. And when you combine that with his longevity, he won his first and last Australian Open 19 years apart. This guy is one of the all-time greats, and the only thing better than his tennis is his humility, one of the nicest guys on the tour.
Yeah, there was a great generation of Australian players, and what great attitudes they had. They worked almost as teammates on the road because they were so far from home. They were always on the road. But what I love about this story is that he was always getting better. If you're still winning titles in your 40s, you're still looking at ways to improve. How do you keep that level up? The best stat that we could come across, Ken, he won the U.S. Open in 1956, wasn't able to play a Grand Slam again until 1968, the French Open, won that one. Almost 12 years apart and just went right back into winning. He was such a natural player. Looking at those videos, he's so fun to watch. He was a treat to have.
Calling him Muscles is like calling Prakash scrawny. You heard Billie Jean King say that, like Lindsay said, a player that the players wanted to see play, Prakash. So what was it about his game that made him so popular among his peers?
I think it was the things you don't necessarily see on TV, but playing as a high-level athlete, a high-level tennis player, you're able to appreciate those things. But what I've heard for decades about Ken is, of course, that magnificent backhand. I got to see him up close a few times. He actually hit with me when I was a kid at about 9 years old. But there used to be a Pro-Am event up in Long Island right before the U.S. Open, the Huggy Bear event, where an older player would play along with a current pro. And Muscles might have been, I don't know, in his 50s. And he'd have guys in the top 10 at that time on the ATP Tour banging down serves at 135 miles an hour. And his eyes were so good, he'd be putting the backhand down the line this way, down at their feet this way, throwing a lob over them. And I just could not imagine how, even at that age, he was able to see the ball so well. Just a magnificent talent. And as Paul said, an absolute gem of a guy.
I love to hear these stories about the former generations of tennis legends. All right, well, Ken Rosewall, the only male player to win a Grand Slam in 3 separate decades. Let that sink in. When we